Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair, and joining me today is Kathy Baughman McLeod. She's CEO of Climate Resilience for All, a gender-focused climate adaptation nonprofit, which is dedicated to the protection of people and livelihoods from extreme heat and all its impacts. So this topic is going to be about extreme heat, and if you are from the subcontinent, you are familiar with what's going on right now. We had this really weird 2 to 3 week period where there was a cyclone in the Bay of Bengal and excessive rainfall over there. And then we had extreme heat in the Indian subcontinent and in Pakistan, where in New Delhi, temperatures came close to 50 degrees Celsius. Dozens of people passed away, unfortunately. A lot of effort went into closing schools and getting people water on the streets, etc. And this has become the norm. And in this norm, what happened also was that this all intersected with the world's largest democratic elections in India, which because of the heat wave, there was a fear that turnout would be low. It was a bit lower, but not much lower, but that came at high cost. Politicians fainted, workers fainted, people who were campaigning outside fainted. And this has become the norm across much of the world. Here in Washington, we're expecting hotter than average summer. I think the city's predicting six extra days beyond the average of high heat. And so Kathy is somebody who knows all about heat mapping and is one of the world's experts in this space. She was named by Reuters as one of 20 Trailblazing Women in Climate for 2024 and is a former colleague of mine at the Atlantic Council as well. So Kathy, thank you so much for taking out the time today and welcome to Pakistonomy.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here.
I want to start with sort of heat waves and heat wave mapping because you've done some groundbreaking work on this topic. Obviously, for a lot of people and a lot of communities, including in the global south, in the Indian subcontinent, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, this has become a major, major challenge. But people still don't understand that heat waves actually can be mapped and they can be understood. Help us understand why it is important to invest resources, first of all, in beginning to understand heat waves and beginning to map them across geographies as well.
Well, the first thing to understand is that extreme heat is killing more people than any other climate hazard. And it is little understood. It is silent, it's invisible, it doesn't have the visual dynamism. It's not good TV. It doesn't have the dynamism of a hurricane, a cyclone with a sideways tree, or the cars floating down the street and the farm animals and the drama. A heat wave, if you did an aerial photograph from one day to the next, and you may have had mass casualty, you can't see really the difference unless you've had fire. And so it is silent, invisible, and killing more people than anything else in terms of climate hazards. And yet we are not equipped to meet the challenges of extreme heat. And one of the things that is really interesting is that people, we know that vulnerable communities and elderly groups and pregnant women are oftentimes disproportionately impacted by, well, lots of things. Poverty is a big driver, but heat is hitting everyone, and heat is now so prevalent and accelerating that young, relatively fit people who believe I'm not in that group, and no one wants to think of themselves as vulnerable anyway, but young people are fit and going out and they're going to exercise and they're going to play sports and they're going to do the work that they always do. And they are going to succumb to heat and not recognize the signals that their body is giving them. And so another key thing to say about extreme heat is that the nighttime temperatures are as important as the daytime temperatures. And we all gravitate toward those big, shocking temperatures, 50 C in Delhi. And the fact is, one of the biggest indicators of your health and whether you wake up the next day and make mistakes at work and hurt yourself or others, or make a mistake on your computer or whatever, is because you were sleeping in the heat. And for communities living in informal settlements, they don't have air conditioning. Maybe there's a fan, maybe. And a lot of times the corrugated steel roofs are the standard, and those are like hot boxes. They're like a toaster oven, they're absorbing heat and then emanating that heat overnight. And so when the body doesn't rest, you go to work, you get up, you're tired, you're dragging. And so you have this idea of like, oh, 50C is so hot. It is very hot, and you have to add humidity. But the nighttime temperatures are really important, because if it doesn't cool down, that's when you start to see death and illness at higher rates. The other thing that's interesting is that when you have a hot day and you have another hot day, you have less death and sickness. When you have a cooler day and then a hot day, that's when you're going to see more. And so early in the heat season, when you have the first heat wave, is when you're going to have more death and sickness. And so just learning about, I'd call it heat literacy, recognizing the signs. If you're supervising workers outside, your kids are playing outside, schoolyards, and, all of that, we need to have a higher level of understanding of what heat effects look like. And the other thing, I mean, I could go on and on. I'll take a break because I know you have some other questions, but we've built our cities for a climate that doesn't exist anymore. We have glass and concrete. And so you've got glass that's, putting light onto the street from the windows. We've got black asphalt absorbing heat and then emanating it at night. So the materials we've built in our cities are furthering the heat. And then we have a weather phenomenon called El Nino, which is making it even hotter. And in some places, El Nino is abating. And this is really interesting because scientists are now out of speaking of mapping, they're out of a map because they don't know why it's so hot. So the acceleration is so great. And Europe is heating at twice the rate. There are 2 or 3 places in the world, and Europe is one of them, where it's heating more quickly than other places. The Antarctic is another one. And so there's this, when you're out of the scientific explanation as to why it's so hot, that's a very scary position for us to be in the practitioner community, because we don't have a map. We're now expecting the worst. And of course, and I'm sure we'll get into this, we have to stop emitting greenhouse gases. I mean, full stop, because we're just making it hotter. And even if we stop, we'll still have these temperatures. And so we're just getting our minds around the economic costs. For a worker in New Delhi who works outside, they lose a quarter of their income every day to extreme heat. 8% of Bangkok's GDP evaporates to heat because so many people are doing business on motorbikes, and that heat coming off of the asphalt to the person's body exposed on the motorbike. The U.S. economy, $100 billion every year, going to $500 billion by 2040. I think it's 2040. And that's just in one category of labor productivity losses. I mean, that's what those losses are. And so it's costing. Now, there are tons of solutions. This is the other thing. It's a very positive agenda. Of all the climate action agendas, you can get out of bed every day and do something good to cool people, and nobody has to die from extreme heat. Like, all death from extreme heat is preventable. If you recognize it, you know what to do, and you have the capacity to do it. This is life-saving stuff. There are lots of things we can do.
So this is a good overview, right? And I have a follow-up on a particular part, which is, you said that it's like a silent killer, right? You don't see it. You don't see it like floods. You don't see it like high winds. You don't see it like a blizzard. But from a weather pattern point of view, it can be mapped, if I know correctly, right? You can predict and the oncoming, incoming, what's going on, etc. What does it feel like? The app now tells you that, etc. From your work around the world, like, what have you seen countries or cities or jurisdictions begin to do right in terms of beginning to map heat waves, and as an outcome of that, inform people about what they need to do? Because, I mean, as you said, really fit people think that nothing's going to happen to them. But I actually had a friend of mine in the Delhi heat wave just a few days ago. He had a heat stroke. Thankfully, he's fine. He's okay. But he got a heat stroke, and he's not even somebody who works outside that much. It was basically literally from home, going out to get to the car, going out for a walk a little bit, and then going to the office. And the office is air conditioned. But in that very short period of time, he got heat stroke. So again, it's one of those things that a lot can be done in terms of information and knowledge sharing. But I was
Mhm.
curious to hear from you on what you've seen places begin to do right in terms of just the basic information sharing and mapping of heat waves.
Well, the first is to get a sense, as you're saying, of you map, so we can map the places in a community, city, region where the vulnerability is highest. And so you have um, the ability to say, I have forecast data for a heat wave. I know that a heat wave is coming. And I know that these places, either because of geomorphology or because of poverty or because of tree cover, lacking tree cover, or um, because of drought from the year before, these places are the most vulnerable to this heat wave. And so a community can build a heat action plan and prioritize where they're going to take action, for whom and where, and what are the solutions. Which solutions work? Is this a built environment solution, like shading in the marketplace or in the bus stops, or is this a green, nature-based solution? Do we need urban greenery here, green space, water features, urban, these mini forests that are really successful at creating cool spots? They're cooling centers. One of them just opened in Jodhpur in Gujarat, through the Mahela Housing Trust and NRDC work together to create a net zero cooling center. So you've got built environment solutions, cool roofs, green roofs, all of that. And then there are policy solutions. You think about, let's change the hours of when people are coming to work for certain types of work that they're doing. Can they be changed to cooler times? But just back to the mapping concept. So you can set your priorities. You can say, this is our heat action plan. And there are lots of tools for heat action plans. And there are many, many of them in India. There's one, we work closely with the mayor of Freetown, and part of our team is the chief heat officer of Freetown, Sierra Leone. And the first heat action plan of Africa is Freetown's plan. And it's rigorously built with lots of stakeholder input and community input, and also with a grant from NOAA to do that mapping that you're describing. They said, these are the hotspots. This is where the attention needs to be focused. And there are sometimes factors that you could never see with the naked eye that analysis reveals is a place that's extremely or profoundly more vulnerable, and you would never know it, unless you do this sort of analysis. But that chain of thinking of, let's map the priorities of the community. We, of course, you have to have that relationship with the Met Service to be watching for those heat waves to come. And are they dry heat waves? Or are they tropical heat waves? That matters. The humidity matters a lot. And I'll just put a pin in the health side of this for a minute. But the step is, we identify the most vulnerable communities. We identify the interventions which can help reduce the risks of heat here. We put a price on those interventions, and we figure out how to finance it. You implement them and you test them. And then you start again. And so go down your list of priorities. And so that all sounds pretty easy, but there are very few communities doing it. And we're just getting our mind around this. We have schools closing and metro systems shutting down, and airplanes don't fly after 120 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about, what would that be? 47 maybe C. And your iPhone or your smartphone shuts down at 95 Fahrenheit, 37, maybe 30, 36, something like that. So we've got some fundamental vulnerabilities as a society in terms of critical infrastructure. But anyway, your point is, what can you do? And you can map the community, identify the priorities, and then be ready. You've got to have a heat response plan, as well as these longer term things you can do, like growing urban forests and thinking about built environment interventions. You need to be thinking about, if I have 3 days notice, which neighbors need to be visited by, like an urban rescue type team, or the Red Cross, or what is the plan for the neighborhood to watch out for each other, for citizens and neighbors who are perhaps more vulnerable than others.
So that's on the urban side. I was curious to hear your thoughts on what's going on the rural side, right? Because those
Mm,
communities are far apart, especially in like global south countries,
hmm
rural Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or rural
hmm
Punjab in Pakistan or Sindh, where the heat is really crazy, but you are distributed. And the heat, like, what does the heat action plan look like if you are looking at sort of more dispersed rural populations where farmers are out and about and doing it's usually crop season, planting season, or harvest season when these heat waves are now striking? Because like one of the things in India and Pakistan we've seen, right, is that the
Oh
heat
yeah.
waves are now coming in wheat harvesting season, which
hmm
increases the risk. So what are you
hmm
beginning to see in terms of trends and things that are happening on the rural
For the
side
rural
and farming
communities.
communities?
Yeah. So, in that same temporal range, like, what's the response, 3 days out? What happens during the heat wave? What happens immediately after? But then what are the longer term interventions that can build resilience to heat? And one of those in the longer term is adapting seeds that can withstand drought and heat. And so there's a lot of work going on in the regenerative agriculture community and the climate smart ag world of finding those sorts of species that are more resistant to the heat and to drought. In terms of, we work with a group, Self-Employed Women's Association in India, and we have um, a program that pays. So for those who don't know, the SEVA, Self-Employed Women's Association, is a union of 3 million workers in the informal sector, women, all women, in 18 states across India. We have a program that is a micro insurance that pays when it gets too hot for them to work. And as we said, there are of course disproportionately impacted communities. Women, um, are really impacted. They're impacted physiologically, culturally, because of the role that women play all over the world, to get water, make the food, um, um, eat or drink water last. We could go on. Um, and then the third is financially. So they're losing income because of the heat, because the heat is either scorching their crops or making the things they sell in the market go bad before it should, before they can sell it. Meats and fruits and vegetables. Um, they Men can work at night, and the women have to take care of the kids, and so they miss a shift, and so all of these things add up. And so the point for this product is, when it gets too hot for you to work, you get a payment. And so um, for the farmers in our program, there's also a piece of physical equipment that farmers can choose, and many of them choose a tarp, and the tarp covers the crops from the heat, from scorching the crop. The other thing is that an early warning system is so key, because if you know that a heat wave is coming in 2 days, you're what we've learned is that women in particular make different buying decisions. They buy fewer fruits and vegetables because they can't keep them fresh if they don't have mechanical cooling, if they don't have a way to keep them cool or keep them fresh. And so the heat action plan for rural areas is less tested, and it's more of discrete interventions of early warning systems, um, and making sure that they understand the health effects, that if they go out, that they change their hours of when they go out, and seeking shade during the day. Some very basic things.
So the other thing related to that, right? I mean, you're familiar. We've talked about the catastrophic floods in Pakistan in August 2022, $30+ billion in loss and damages, reconstruction still, like, people, communities that had barely recovered from the floods a decade ago, prior to that, were barely back on their feet, and then they got hit. And now we know, because of climate change and extreme weather events, that Pakistan in particular is one of the core epicenters of this issue, where because of the
Climate
glaciers in
vulnerability.
the north and climate vulnerability is very high. On heat and other extreme weather events, based on your experience, like, are there models or things a country like Pakistan can learn from as it sort of embarks on this new journey as a country to say, we live where we live. This is the country,
Yeah.
and climate is going to do what it's going to do. So, what are some things that
Hmm.
proactively policymakers in a place like Pakistan can do not only to mitigate the damages and the losses, productivity and otherwise from heat, but just extreme weather events writ large.
Hmm. Hmm. One of the most impressive stories comes from Bangladesh and the cultural cohesion they've built around preparation for climate. And they have invested, and the government, I think they made an initial investment of something like 10 million US. This would be maybe 10 years ago. And then, and I'd have to get the numbers to be precise, but, and then maybe 5 years ago went from 10 million to 100 million that they put in of their own government's money to build resilience planning, education, grants for local governments, courses for local government officials, and how they have built a culture of preparedness. And this is a global north example, but I lived and worked in Florida for a long time, and I know exactly what a category 3 hurricane is. I know from the fact that the hurricane season starts June 1st, and I know that when the alert comes from the National Weather Service that what you should do in the category 3 storm, and there's a hurricane preparedness kit, and the schools have drills, and so those sorts of things that build a cultural understanding. I would say the Dutch have done the same thing in terms of managing water. They had a moment of like a never again moment when they had a big flood come in. I want to say it was like 1919, 1920, and they manage water within a centimeter. And it's remarkable. And so it is, I mean, I think the first water management district was in 1523. And so it is a cultural norm that they think about how to manage water. And I think we need to, as communities and countries and cultures, build a culture that is cohesion, meaning, one of the things that is most determinant of your survival in a disaster is not your radio or your water bottle. It is if you know your neighbor, and if they know you, and if they come to check on you. That's it. And so we have to have that community level connectivity and understanding of how, to help each other survive through these things. And so it's one example. And Bangladesh has done it. The Dutch have done it with water. Other cultures, and that is a very different thing to say from the Dutch to Pakistan in terms of the resources available to do that. I know that, and when you think about um, the public education and awareness that and I would say I know this for extreme heat. I've worked in other climate hazards and climate resilience for a long time, but that awareness piece of what's going to happen and what you need to know, and um, don't don't go here near the riverbed, don't live here near the riverbed, go up a ways, and those sorts of basic things are really important in terms of building education for people to know how to make the best decisions in the face of these things. And then there are so many organizations that are doing this sort of outreach in communities that are getting, climate literacy up. And I would say climate impact literacy. Yes, it may be worthwhile for the community to know that it is the industrial processes of the world and agricultural processes that are creating the greenhouse gases that make it hotter. I think it's less important. It's more important to know what you need to do to protect yourself and your family.
Yeah, and that brings me to sort of a key question I had for you, right? There's this broader conversation on adaptation versus resilience, and we are in an era where um, climate is and extreme weather events and climate change is going to be the norm. There's no way to get out of this, right? And so cities, communities, rural communities, urban communities, all of that has to adapt. You talked about asphalt and glass in urban environments that
Mm-hmm.
sort of traps
Mm-hmm.
the heat, the
Mm-hmm.
concrete. That's why temperatures are so much higher, even here in Washington, D.C., when you're on K Street, as opposed to you walk a couple of miles away into Rock Creek Park and it's like much cooler, much, the air is much better, etc.
That distance can be that temperature shift can be like 8 C. I mean,
Wow.
so much
Yeah.
difference. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
how do you think about like this whole adaptation conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
What do we need to do, especially in countries? that are still developing that have resource constraints on the negative side, one could say, but on the positive side, they also have not developed much of the urban infrastructure that's part of
Hmm.
the norm in the global north, right? So in ideally, you could say, okay, you can actually leapfrog ahead because the infrastructure you're going to build, you need to think about the next 100 years, and so you can do certain other things with it as well. How do you think about, and how should people think about this resilience versus adaptation conversation?
Well, one more. This answers two of your questions, and this is going back just a little bit to the last question you had. The knowledge of our forebears was immense in terms of building to accommodate the climate, and indigenous knowledge of how to build, the materials we use, the ventilation practices, the engineering. Um, you'll find this in India, you'll find it in Ecuador, you'll find it everywhere, that there are techniques that we can use where we don't need air conditioning, and we don't use steel, and we don't use the metal, we use other things. And bringing that back, it's smart, it's less expensive. The the push though comes from an industry long established and normalized that this is what a gleaming city looks like. It
This is
needs to
what
be like this.
modernity is, the glass
Yes.
skyscraper.
Yes. And so if you're trying to be modern and you want to be a place that attracts um, young people and industry and new jobs and that sort of thing, should look like this. And all of the marketing and all of the materials in the industry, and um, they're they're going against the idea that we would go with natural materials and age old practices of airflow and nature based solutions. And it might take longer. And how do we source those materials? And so it's doable. I mean, I think the biggest answer for you in thinking of rebuilding Pakistan would be to go back to the practices that worked long ago and re envision what a successful city, a sustainable city looks like. And it would be a beautiful thing. I mean, they're also visually beautiful. And there are several movements in India that I know of, and probably in Pakistan too, to do that, and great examples of ventilation that you don't need air conditioning. And you may have seen in the, I think it's the New York Times today, that it says Parisians don't want Olympic visitors, people coming to the Olympics in Paris, don't want you to have air conditioning. We're going to show you what we can do to not air conditioning you. And everybody else is saying, um, mm, no thanks. Paris can be miserable in the summer. We like the air conditioning. Thank you. And so you've got a cultural hill to climb also. But
Yeah.
but that was a little bit of a rabbit trail. Well, not a rabbit trail, but I went a little too far down that road. But that's a really important piece, is that indigenous knowledge, that we're not respecting it enough. We're not giving it its due, and there's a lot of things working against it. But I think a vision of a future city is using all of that knowledge,
Yeah,
and there are lots of experts for that.
I've seen sort of these old pictures in parts of rural Sindh, or not rural Sindh, even cities in Sindh from
Mm-hmm,
1930,
mm-hmm,
1935 in Hyderabad and Karachi, where they have these wind catchers, almost like chimneys at the top of buildings,
mm-hmm,
which are
mm-hmm,
supposed to catch and circulate the wind
mm-hmm,
into the home. And the way the circulation works is that it has a natural cooling effect. And so
mm-hmm,
even on a hot day when those wind catchers work, and they used to work effectively because you kind of knew the pattern of the winds. And that's how, to
mm-hmm,
your point on indigenous knowledge of what these patterns look like. In the summer, the heat wind comes a certain direction, and the winter, it's a different direction. Those catchers would work. You don't have that anymore. And I would
yeah.
be pretty surprised if anybody is alive. Very few people, I would say, are alive who actually knew how that engineering
Know
worked
how
and
to
would
do
have
it.
to
Yeah.
redo it and relearn it, right? That's the other problem, is a lot of this knowledge is gone. And similarly in Balochistan, I know from a friend and colleague of mine that the age-old mechanism of water management was a communal water management system.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
now that
Hmm.
is struggling because of migration, urbanization, but also because of canal irrigation that has been promoted, which is centralized dams, and then you distribute the water. So the historic aquifers are no longer maintained. But
Yep.
in an arid environment, those were the ones that were managed for such a long time.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, there's something to be learned over there as well. Last question for you in terms of obviously we're in the midst of another record-breaking summer.
Hmm.
How should policymakers, especially urban policymakers, be thinking about this new norm? What are
Hmm.
some things that you would say as advice for them to say, look, it's always going to be hotter, it's going to get worse, and we still have a window that where we can adapt to this and have things in place. What are some things you would say policymakers ought to begin doing today to prepare for what's coming down the pipe in 5, 7, 10 years?
The first thing I would say is save lives. Who is most at risk of dying in your community? And it's usually seniors. And depending on the built environment and everything else, prioritize the communities where you think people's lives are most at risk and come up with some quick, cheap solutions to keep people alive through this summer. Just start, save lives. That'd be the first agenda item. The next agenda item is to build a heat plan. And there are many examples of heat action plans and the how to's and things like that. And so um, you could build one pretty quickly. You want community input, but you'd need some GIS, and you would need some MAT data, and you're some inputs and that sort of thing. But you could get a pretty quick plan that said these are the places where we are most at risk. Our metro system or this particular industry. You think about garment workers in lots of places in the global south, and is the industry at risk? Does that mean our economy is at risk? And so what are the things that need to happen to do that? Schools are closing. What are the long-term impacts of schools being closed? I think I was trying to calculate how many kids were out of school for more than a week in this last stretch of heat.
Yeah, and if I
And
may
I
interrupt you, like this is something
please.
a friend of mine raises in his weekly show quite a bit, that in Pakistan, at least now you're beginning to, in Pakistani Punjab in particular, the school year is being shortened in the summer because of early onset of the heat waves, and it's being shortened in the winter because of smog season. So you
Mhm.
actually have two sort of days long periods where schools are shut because you don't want to send a kid out to school when it's really terrible air. So you keep them indoors and school is shut. And when it's really hot, you say, okay, for these few days, school will be shut because it's too hot.
Yeah, yeah. And so is that then you're decreasing your competitiveness with the level of education of your society? You're diminishing your ability to innovate and compete, and um, that's going the wrong direction. We haven't talked about child and maternal health because heat is such a big impact on on pregnant people and on young children and babies, um, especially in the informal sector, especially women working outside pregnant. But so just back to the thinking about the heat action plan and the priorities and your critical infrastructure. First save lives first, and then think about where are we most at risk and exposed, and then what are the things that we can do. And there are things in motion right now in communities, big financing packages or industrial plans that have not been run through a screen of would this survive 40C or 45C or whatever that temperature is for your community. And you've just financed and you're going to pay debt service on something. And you have no idea if that thing is going to make it through that increase in numbers of days at more than 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 C or whatever that number is. And of course, if the body and the stuff isn't used to the temperature, it doesn't matter what the temperature is. If you're not used to it and it goes up, whether that's 28 to 33 or 37 to 48, you still have the community breaking down because it's not accustomed to it, especially the human body, but also your stuff, your your infrastructure, the flight line asphalts buckle and melts and all that sort of stuff. So as a thinking about from a governance and public financial management, you have processes in place right now, and you're about to sign papers on financing something big. Have you looked at it to see, will it survive? Will it compete or perform in very high temperatures? And what does that mean if it doesn't? And which materials are you using? And so that's another thinking less from the community and more from the leadership of a jurisdiction.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Like my fun fact, or my fun fact that made me think about this a lot more, was the fact that you have chocolate companies now already investing in new machinery and new recipes because the temperatures that regular chocolate that you get in the supermarket right now, your favorite Cadbury or Kit Kat, is not built for 1C or 1.5C or 2C more temperatures. So they melt a lot quicker now. The shelf life is terrible. So now they're thinking about, okay, if we're going to upgrade this plant because it's reaching its end of life, we got to think that this plant is going to be functional for 20 years, and we're going to build it for this new recipe because that
Right.
recipe will determine the equipment we need and the cooling and everything else. And so the innovation is going in. And I was like, oh, never thought about the fact that climate change would change my chocolate recipe down
Yeah.
the years, right? So that
Yeah.
was my aha
Yeah.
moment of like, you need to
Yeah.
think about all these things. Um,
Yeah.
this has been a wonderful conversation. Before I let you go, I always ask my guests about this. What are some books that you would recommend that people pick up and read? It can be about climate and extreme heat, or it can be on any other topic.
So I would recommend, and they're on my shelf right here. I'd recommend three. Um, they they all end beautifully. One is a collection of stories, so there are lots of endings. The first one is Ministry for the Future. This is by someone named Kim Stanley Robinson, and he writes about a ministry that is created that is supra to the UN, that is assigned to protect, defend, preserve the rights of unborn Earth's inhabitants. So future generations do not have their rights represented, and there is a ministry for that future.
It's one of
And
my
that
favorite books.
It's got everything in it. It's got something for everybody, and it's funny and touching, and there's some microeconomic and monetary policies
There's
slipped in
even
there.
Bitcoin. There's a form of Bitcoin in there. Yep, I remember
Yes,
that.
yeah, and it is worth it. It's a big one, so you could listen to it, you can read it, but I highly recommend it. It ends well, tells you that we can do this. So that's the first one. Second one is something called the Heat Will Kill You First, and it is by Jeff Goodell. And Jeff Goodell is a climate writer. He wrote a book called The Water Will Come. He is a masterful storyteller, and he explores heat as a force of energy and as a societal factor. It's very different than it's not just a story about heat and how it hurts people. It's exploring it through the changes that we'll have from these temperatures, where mosquitoes that bring malaria won't survive where they are now, and they'll go north, and a different kind of mosquito that brings a different kind of disease will take hold, and that mosquito doesn't feed at night. So all of the mosquito netting that has been trained and installed won't be effective against the mosquito-borne illness that's coming because of the rising temperatures. It's not also dark and daunting. There's an exploration of all sorts of things, and chapter 12 is about some of the work that we did. So that's my favorite chapter. And the third book is called All We Can Save. It's by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. She is a climate advocate and an oceanographer, ocean scientist. And the book is a collection of essays. They're all women writers, and it's all about why we work to save our planet and protect it for future generations, not just biodiversity, but also do this climate work. And it's uplifting and beautiful.
Thank you for those recommendations. And the other two I haven't read, but Ministry for the Future, like what I loved, as you said, was that it shows we can do this. And even what I loved in that, there was a specific part where they sort of even put the author puts like big oil as a solutions driver because of the pumping engineering that big oil has that nobody else had. So they're
Yeah.
like, even that equipment can be used as a
Yeah.
solution for what we need
Yeah.
done. So even you're an
Yeah.
ally. Yes, you've helped
Yeah.
bring us to the brink, but you can help us out.
Yeah.
And it's got
Yeah.
environmental terrorism and it's got wet bulb
Yeah.
temperatures and all sorts of great science in the middle that I was
Yeah.
like, oh, did not know that this was, what the author was going to talk about. But it's a great, great book. So I recommend that, and I will get the other two
Great.
ordered as well. So thank you so much for those
You're
recommendations.
welcome.
Thank you for your time.
I
Keep up
enjoyed
the
it.
great work. I know you're doing fantastic work in India and
Thank
some
you.
in Pakistan as well. Hope we can
Yes,
do
we didn't
more
even
work
talk
in
about Fundo
Pakistan.
Core.
Yeah, we
Yes.
got
Yeah.
to do
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
work, have you do more
Yeah.
work in Pakistan, and,
Yeah. I'm ready.
talk about that at another time as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to see you. Thanks for the conversation.